Shabbat Shalom. This morning I'd like to speak about one of the most inspiring people I've ever met, Henry Kronberg of Las Vegas, Nevada, whom I had the honor of getting to know while I was the assistant rabbi at Temple Beth Shalom of Las Vegas. Henry was a Holocaust survivor. He survived several death camps, and the amount of trauma he experienced in the camps was so atrocious that I kid you not, oftentimes I've had nightmares about the things he described to me. They're just egregious. I once asked Henry how he survived the war in the camps, and he said, "Rabbi, I lied." And I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "The Nazis would say, 'We need a mechanic. Which one of you is a mechanic?' And he said, I raised my hand and said, 'I am.' But Rabbi, I had never held a tool in my life. I was a painter from Poland, but I figured I'd give them a skill they needed." And I guess this plan worked. Eventually, Henry was recognized for his painting and art skills, and he was promoted to work in the Gestapo's headquarters and became foreman of the painters during the war, a position he held for 2 years until he was liberated by American troops near the Bergen-Belsen camp at the end of the war. Henry told me that his entire family was killed in the camps. He went in at about age 19. But after he was liberated, Henry came to America and was trying to make a living in California, when one Saturday he was eating Kiddush lunch at a bar mitzvah in Los Angeles, and someone at the table said, "Henry, how's your sister doing?" And he scoffed and reminded them that his sister had been murdered in the concentration camps. But the person was shocked by his answer and said, "What are you talking about? We saw her last month at another bar mitzvah." Turns out Henry's sister had also survived the camps. But when he called her on the phone to reconnect, she heard his voice and thought someone was playing a joke on her, so she hung up the phone. It's only when he called back again that she let out a very emotional wail, and the two were reunited over the phone years after the Shoah, after both assuming the other had died in a camp. She told Henry that her and her husband had bought several pawn shops in Las Vegas, of all places, and she suggested that Henry move out to Nevada to help them run them, which he did. Henry apparently had a knack for running the business, and he grew the pawn shop to an empire of stores all over Sin City, and he even built some shops on what is now the Las Vegas Strip, meaning that when the city expanded Las Vegas Boulevard, they bought the land that his stores sat on, which meant that Henry became a gajillionaire overnight. When I knew Henry, I was a little younger, and I was so inspired by him and his love of arts. He encouraged me to play music, and I finally decided to start saving up for this bass guitar that I always wanted, the highly coveted, highly expensive Ernie Ball Music Man Stingray bass. I told my wife that I wanted to start saving up for the bass. I'd put money away here and there, but we were expecting our third child at the time, Ezekiel, so she was a little hesitant about putting away money for an awesome guitar. It was actually 2 days after Ezekiel was born. He was born on the 4th of July. He's our little firecracker. Henry drove up to the synagogue. Henry was 102 years old at the time. And he gave me a $100 bill and wished me a mazel tov on the birth of my son. It was 113 degrees that day. But that wouldn't stop Henry from giving me a blessing. And I invited him to the Brit Milah, and he was thrilled. However, just several days later, Henry had some chest pains, and the doctors told him that he needed emergency heart surgery, to which he said, and I quote, "I'm 102, I've lived a good life, just let me die." Dear friends, when Henry passed, I can't express to you just how thoroughly devastated I was. And to make matters worse, it seemed like every Jewish tradition regarding burial and mourning practices, Henry chose not to participate in. In fact, he had made a thorough list of things he did not want when he died. He told his family he didn't want a shiva. He told his family he didn't want a tahara. He told his family he didn't want a large funeral. And there was no unveiling, and the tombstone they did have barely had any Hebrew on it at all. I asked my mentor, Rabbi Felipe Goodman, I said, what is up with all this? And he told me that in his experience, that it was actually pretty common for Shoah survivors not to want religious funerals. Normally, Rabbi Goodman said, I would insist on such things like a tahara for a regular burial. But, Jonathan, if you survive the Holocaust, you basically get whatever you want in death because you've been through enough. And if I'm being honest, I struggled with that answer for a long time. Because on the one hand, as a rabbi, I must insist that Jewish ritual matters. I believe that ritual gives us a certain structure to death, a structure to grief. I believe that ritual gives language to loss. I believe that ritual is one of the ways Judaism insists that even in death, a person is held, honored, and blessed, and given honor, kavod. But then we come to this week's Parshat Vayechi, and I must admit that after reading it, my opinion has changed. Vayechi opens with Jacob's death, but it is unlike almost any other deathbed scene described in the Torah. Jacob does not receive what we modern Jews would recognize as a standard Jewish burial. Instead, the Torah tells us that Jacob is embalmed, or essentially mummified. Now, even saying these words as a modern rabbi, saying these words out loud kind of makes me wince. Embalming? Ugh. An Egyptian practice, not a Jewish one. And what's interesting is the Torah doesn't apologize for this. It simply just tells us what happened. And if you think about it, it's a little strange. Jacob, our ancestor, Yisrael, the father of all the Jewish tribes, he dies in exile, surrounded by a completely foreign culture after a lifetime of deception, struggle, grief, and trauma. Keep in mind, Jacob buried a wife. He believed his beloved son Joseph was dead for decades. He had fled violence. He had faced famine and often much fear. And somehow, even Jacob, the one whose very name becomes Yisrael, he does not die with a pure ritual ending. Why? Because trauma changes people, and trauma changes how people relate to ritual. Now, I can never know, but I would guess for many Holocaust survivors, Jewish ritual was not a comfort in the camps. It was a perhaps terrible reminder, a reminder of prayers whispered inside the barracks, a reminder of funerals without bodies, perhaps a reminder of a God who to them felt silent while the world burned. So when Henry said he didn't want a shiva, he didn't want a tahara, he didn't want words carved deeply into stone, initially I was very hurt and confused. But after years of thinking about this, I think I have begun to understand that his decision wasn't a rejection of his Judaism. It was simply a response to trauma that I can never, ever understand. Hopefully none of us will ever have to understand it. Now, fortunately, Judaism, our faith, is a religion that understands this. We are a people who know that survival itself can be a form of faith. We get that sometimes simply choosing to live, to build businesses, to make art, to bless a newborn baby with a $100 bill in 113-degree heat, we understand that that in and of itself can be its own sacred act. And that, my friends, brings us back to blessings, the other great theme of this Parshat, Vayechi. You see, Jacob on his deathbed does not focus on the ritual. He actually completely messes up the ritual. He puts his hands on the wrong kids. Rather, he focuses on blessing his family, his children, each one individually, each one imperfectly, but each one honestly. And you know what? Henry did the same for me. He blessed me with encouragement. He blessed me with belief. And he blessed my son Zeke with his presence and his joy and $100. I didn't realize it when he passed, but he blessed me one last time as well. A few days after I helped officiate Henry's funeral, you know, the quiet one, the simple one, the one that he asked for, it was in July. It was excruciatingly hot, terrible, short, awful funeral. A couple days later, his daughter reached out to thank me with an envelope that arrived in the mail. And inside the envelope was a check and a note that said, "My dad loved you and he wanted you to have this." And the amount on that check was exactly enough to buy the bass guitar I'd been saving for, the Ernie Ball Music Man Stingray. And I sat there holding that check, and I looked up toward heaven and I smiled, because that is how blessings work. They don't always come in the way that we expect. They don't always come wrapped in ritual. Sometimes they come wrapped in memory. Sometimes in generosity. Sometimes in the echo of a life that endured the worst of humanity, but still chose to give to others. Parshat Vayechi reminds us that the end of life is not only about how we bury our dead, it's about how we carry their blessings forward. Dear friends, if you remember nothing else about this sermon, please remember that Henry survived. Henry built. Henry blessed. And in doing so, he taught me, and I'm teaching you, that even after unspeakable trauma, life itself can be a blessing. May we honor those blessings. May we pass them on. And may we live lives worthy of the people who gave them to us. In conclusion, I bought that bass guitar, and I named it Henry. And every time I play it, I think of him. And while I might not be the best bass player, I figured if Henry could fake being a mechanic, I can fake being a musician. Shabbat shalom.